But this was very new of its time. We didn't really know about their style of hockey, how they played, but they showed us. Here's a clip once again. This is the back to the Avco Cup, I believe, 1978, featuring the hotline, which is Hall, Hedberg, and Nilsson. Afterwards, we talked to Geoff Kirbyson, who writes about this very subject.
Now it's Nilsson at his own line for Winnipeg to Hedberg, down and across the New England line, puts on the brakes, back to the point. Kent Nilsson shot, right on, score! Bobby Hull knocked it in, or was it old Nilsson? The puck is flipped high down the ice, racing after it. Here's an opportunity to score as the New England Whalers' George Lyle raced after it, caught up with it, and beat Joe Daly to the stick side.
Rogers makes a terrific play here on, or Markel makes a terrific play here on Nilsson. He poke checks him there, but Hedberg's following up the play like a good hockey player, and he's got a whole empty net to shoot at him. He hasn't missed too many of those.
The WHA, I think there might be some listeners, depending on their age group, probably aren't really even familiar with that league. I am looking for Geoff Kirbyson. It's Mike Richards calling from Raw Mike Richards.
Oh, hi, Mike. I just got a note from Dave. He said he tried my landline, didn't work. Do you want me to call you back on my landline?
No, this is working fine if you're okay.
This is great. You sound fantastic.
And just so you know, here's a little surprise party for you. And we're live on camera right now.
Oh.
So if there's... If there's someone that you don't want to say something nice about, you can refrain, or someone who said something bad about your book.
I'll just wait for your questions.
Okay. We just saw a we just saw a clip of that time, and I think Geoff, sometimes it's for a younger generation who didn't really understand how groundbreaking and how different that was. It almost seems surreal. I mean, for me, at the age of 55, when I heard about the WHA, it was hard to get my head around the fact there would not only be competition for the National Hockey League, but the thought of $1 million to play hockey. It blew my mind, and I think I look at that line in the sand and just how really this was the start of what we're actually experiencing now in terms of foreign players, money's played. This was the beginning of it, I think, to a degree.
Well, geez, I totally agree with you. I mean, that was the whole idea behind me writing the Hotline book, in that that these guys were groundbreaking in that they played a hybrid North American European style of game, and a kind of game that no one played, except maybe the Montreal Canadiens a little bit. And that was at a time during, kind of hockey thuggery. And so it was, I mean, you're talking about, you played against those guys. They were virtually impossible to stop because no one had seen that. Because in the old days, people went up and down their wings like you did in table hockey, and nobody crisscrossed, and nobody went into somebody else's space. And Fran Huck was here, he was a member of those teams at the Winnipeg arena closing in 2004, and he said to the whole people there gathering, he said, "You guys were watching the best hockey in the world. You just didn't know it."
And you also bring up a different point, because it was hard for us to accept that. I go back to what we saw in 1972, and I'll give you a little background on myself. My uncle, Guy Kinnear, was one of the legendary trainers of the Leafs at the time, and so working under Harold Ballard, of course, he hated all the Russians. He hated anything to do with Europe. I mean, it's just the way that he was, a true curmudgeon. Except during that one summer, my uncle says to me, "Geez, you won't believe who's going to be coming over playing for the Leafs." And of course, I'm thinking, well, it can't be Russians. Well, here comes Inga Hammerstrom and Boris Salming, and we start to again appreciate just the excellence in the skating, puck handling, and the creativity. And I think from that point, when you look at how the game had changed, that's another, I think, almost milestone in that we started to accept that maybe, just maybe, our technique in hockey wasn't the best in the world.
Well, it's funny you talk about Ballard, because Ballard hated all the Swedes and Europeans except Salming. He loved Salming, and he didn't like Hammerstrom.
No, no, he didn't. Thus, the eggs not breaking if they were in his pockets in the corner crack. Yes.
Yeah, but I talked to Tiger Williams about this a couple of years ago, and he loved Hammerstrom. He thought that he was totally underappreciated. Thought he was one of the most skilled guys around, he was furious at how the league didn't protect Swedes, because he said, we're trying to run these skilled guys out of the league that make our game better at the expense of a bunch of thugs. And if people are paying to watch hockey, he's the kind of guy you want to see play. And so Williams, he was a big supporter of Europeans, both in Toronto and in Vancouver when he was there. And, it's one thing, to talk about Salmi and Hammerstrom is one thing, but, the true trailblazer, and if you ask Hedberg and Nilsson, this was Tony Bergman, because Tony Bergman came over in '72 by himself to Detroit and made that team. And he didn't have anybody else with him. Like, Ulf Nilsson, Anders Hedberg had Lars Erik Sjoberg and Kurt Larson. Hammerstrom and Salmi had each other. But Bergman just thought, well, I'll go and learn English and I'll give it a shot. And my favorite story about him was that early on in the season, he went into the corner and they were playing Philadelphia, and he got cross-checked from behind. And he turned around and said, okay, let's go. And he fought this big guy with a mustache to a draw. And he got back to the bench after the penalty. It was over, and everyone said, are you crazy? Do you know who that was? And he said, well, I only know Bobby Hull and Bobby Orr, so it wasn't one of those guys, so I have no idea who that was. And they said that was Dave the Hammer Schultz. He led the league last year with 450 minutes in penalties. And Bergman said, well, I don't know who he is, but he shouldn't have cross-checked me in the corner.
Yeah. Great story, Geoff. Hey, great talking to you this morning. Whose idea was it from the Jets' perspective to roll the dice on Hedberg and Nilsson? Because obviously those were, 2/3 of the legendary hotline, but nobody could have thought these two unknowns from a different part of the world come over to play with this hockey legend to form one of the greatest lines in the history of the game. But who gets the responsibility tag of taking a chance on these guys, bringing them over, and obviously convincing them that, maybe this little town called Winnipeg in Canada is the place for you?
Well, there's a few guys. One of them is Billy Robinson, who was the Jets director of player personnel, and he told Jerry Wilson, who had a brief career himself with the Montreal Canadiens, and Kerry Wilson was his son, and Jerry Wilson was going to Stockholm on a medical assignment for a year, and Robinson told him to look out for any Swedes that might be good to sign, because Salming and Hammerstrom had already had a year in the league in North America, and one of his students was Anders Hedberg, so he would go out and watch Hedberg play, and he was amazed at how fast this guy was. And there's one game when he was watching the Swedish national team play the Soviet national team, and Hedberg went behind his own net with the puck, and Valery Harlamov, who was generally regarded by a lot of hockey experts as the fastest guy in the world, came at Hedberg from one side of the net, and Hedberg went out the other side. And by the time Hedberg got to the red line, not only with the puck, not only had Harlamov not caught him, but Hedberg was 2 strides further ahead. So he called Robinson and said, listen, you're not going to believe it. There's this guy here who's as fast as lightning. You got to sign this guy. And so you got to come over here. So Robinson went over there, and they talked to Hedberg, and he said, and Hedberg's rights were owned by Toronto. And he said, do you want to come to Winnipeg? And Hedberg said, I'd love to come. Can I? And they said, well, who would you like to bring with you? Make it easier. And he said, well, there's this guy, Ulf Nilsson, who I've never played with, but he's the best centerman here. How about that guy? And they said, okay, well, we'll sign him too. And then they talked to Lars Erik Sjoberg, who was the captain of the Swedish national team.
Yeah.
And he said, yeah, I'll come too. And, kind of Kurt Larson was the goalie, kind of a throw-in. But they all decided that they could go, if they all went individually to the teams that own their rights, they would just kind of be put into that team system. But if they came over as a group, they could maybe have an impact on changing the way the team played and playing the way they like to play. And so that's what they did. And that same season in Winnipeg, they had Veli-Pekka Katola and Heksi Viranta from the Finnish national team. And a couple years later, there were 3 or 4 more Swedes. And so there were more Swedes and Finns playing in Winnipeg in the mid-'70s than were in the rest of North America.
Well, it's just amazing to think of how some of these, in this day and age, they're probably generally, Geoff, not going to another planet and saying, is there anyone else you want us to sign? Yeah.
Well, sure.
Dave Bastel, can you sign him? Sure, why not?
Well, I mean, the way the Jets found other Swedes is they would go to the Swedes on their team and say, "Who else should we get?" And they'd say, "Well, there's this guy, Danny LeBron. Should bring him over here. There's Mats Lind, and Kent Nilsson, who no relation to Ulf Nilsson, but he was from the same city, and so they brought Kent Nilsson. They brought the Magic Man over as a 19-year-old, and no one knew who the hell he was. And but just because not every team could have. Teams didn't have European scouts over there then. They would just talk to guys who they talk to the players, and they would train with these other guys in the summers, or they put on hockey schools with them, and then they would just bring them over. And the funny part about it is that the Rudy Pillis, who was the GM or the coach, I believe, of the Blackhawks in '61 with Bobby Hull, they won the Stanley Cup. Pillis wasn't convinced, and after the first year of the Jets with all these Europeans on the team, they didn't make the playoffs, which was still boggles the minds of all of those guys. And Pillis said, "Okay, well, you know what? This European experiment is okay. Yeah, I understand that 5 of our top 6 scorers were European, but we need more Canadians." And then the rest of the Jets brain trust said they vetoed that. And then they brought in Willie Lindstrom and Mats Lind and Dan LeBron, and then they went on to win the AFCO Cup the following season.
Yeah, exactly. Let me ask you this, because I've had this debate with a lot of different friends that didn't really know much about the WHA and just not as versed as I was in it. When you look at the best Jet roster they had in the 70s in the WHA, if they were to elevate that team, whichever one you want, because there was multiple AFCO Cup wins and so forth, if they were to be elevated at that exact time into the NHL at that exact time, how well or how poor would have that roster have been, in your opinion? I know we're just hypothetically throwing out theories and ideas, but in your opinion, the best Jets team to go into the NHL at that time, how would they fare against the big bad NHL?
Well, the best team, I think, without a doubt, would be the 77-78 team. And that was led by Hull, Hedberg, and Nilsson on the first line. The second line, when Kent Nilsson is your number 2 center, you got a pretty good team.
Oh, yeah.
And the number 2 would have been Kent Nilsson, Dan LeBron, and Willie Lindstrom. And that team, aside from the NHL, they were the key time in that season was they went to Tokyo and played 3 games against the Soviet national team, which was the best that the Soviets had to offer. The previous year, on the New Year's Eve game, the Red Army team had come and played the Montreal Canadiens and tied 3-3 in a game a lot of people consider to be the greatest game of all time. So after they played 3 games in Tokyo and the Jets lost all 3, 2 of them were pretty close, and they came back to Winnipeg and played on January 5th, 1978, and played the Soviet national team. And the Jets beat them 5-3. And they became the first club team to beat the best the Soviets had to offer ever. So I know it was just one game, but the hotline was +5. Hull had 3 and Nilsson had 2. And the line of Harlamov, Petrov, and Mikhailov, which was generally regarded as the greatest line at the time, was -5. And Viktor Tikhonov pulled that line off from playing against the hotline. So if they can beat the best team in the world one night, I think a lot of other people I talked to agreed with me that the Jets would have been, that would have been a 17-team league, I think, at the time.
Yep.
The Jets would have been a top 6 team. Maybe they couldn't have competed with the Montreal Canadiens, who had on the goalie front. They might have had another defenseman or 2, but certainly from the point of view of high octane offense, the Jets were right there. And after, I don't remember if it was after the 76 or the 78 season, but the Jets issued a challenge to the Canadiens, saying, "Listen, the Stanley Cup is a challenge cup. Let's do it." And the Canadiens, of course, would have had nothing to gain from even acknowledging that request. Totally ignored it. And Hull said to me that he didn't think that they could necessarily beat the Canadiens, but they certainly would have put on a hell of a show, and they would have showed how hockey can and should be played to counter, the impact of the Philadelphia Flyers and the Broad Street Bullies and the Birmingham Bulls and teams that were playing much less on skill and much more on intimidation. So it would have been fun. And Hedberg told me he would sit at home sometimes on Saturday night and watch the Leafs play and think, geez, we beat those guys.
Yeah. And it is a great point. Like I said, it's sort of a blue sky thing. You're spitballing stuff. We're throwing it out there hypothetically. But you're telling me that I wouldn't want to have seen just how close the Jets would be to, the Flying Frenchman, because it would have turned into a track meet, which, quite frankly, is a lot of what we see now in the current NHL. And you look at teams like the Bostons and, as you mentioned, Philadelphia, who wanted to slow that thing down, punch everyone in the face. Well, if you can't catch them, it's kind of tough to do. So that would have, as you said, at least at this point, a lot of fun to see skill versus skill. Obviously, it didn't happen and never could happen, I guess. But that's what makes this, I think, so magical. I think your book touches upon a lot of those kinds of things. But I'm just curious, because Bobby Hull has so much in legend and lore, most of it good and some of it not as good, maybe. And I think that when I look at, that time for him, are we saying then, if we're going to be fair about it, when he finally goes to the Jets, he's obviously not the youngest guy. So was that the twilight of his career? Is that fair?
Well, listen, after he came to Winnipeg in 72, and they had their first year was pretty good. They lost in the Africa Cup final, and he scored a zillion points. Of course, after it took him a month to be able to play because the NHL was fighting him in court. But the second year was a bit of a dud, and the team took a step back. And I know he was thinking, what have I done? I could have stayed in Chicago. I could have been playing with all these guys. And he was considering hanging it up then. And then he got a call from Billy Sutherland saying, listen, we got these 2 suites. You should go for a skate with these guys at the St. James Civic Center. And he did. And from the first time they skated together, they all played a similar style of play, and Hull was always all over the ice, so it worked well with those 2 suites. And so I think that that rejuvenated his career. And Hedberg told me that team was in Winnipeg for a reunion back in May. And he told me that the first year that they played together in 74-75, that Hull was the best left winger he'd ever been on the ice with or against. So now, if you use Hull as a measuring stick, as good as he wasn't making the Swedes look good. They were making him look good. So so that just shows, I think, the power of that line. You had maybe one of the greatest players of all time being made to look good by these 2 guys who no one knew who they were. And Roy McGregor watched a lot of that, a lot of the WHA games back then, with the Globe and Mail, and his favorite, the best line he had for me was, you took the guy with the hardest slap shot, Bobby Hull, and paired him with the fastest guy in the world, Anders Hedberg, and the best playmaker, Ulf Nilsson, and they're all on one line, all in Winnipeg, all not in NHL. How does that happen? And when you look back on things, it had to be the confluence of so many, how could that possibly happen? Events for those 3 guys to come together, and it ended up being, the greatest thing for Winnipeg and for the WHA. And if it hadn't been for that line, do what they did, who knows what might have happened or not happened with the eventual merger in 79.
Yeah, so true. And final question from me, Geoff, and thanks again for spending the morning with us. Really appreciate it.
Of course.
I have to ask you about the forward done by Glenn Sather. I know you and I talked about it. Mike and I talked about it before we had you on the air, just a little bit of an introduction of it. But maybe give us your thoughts, and when talking to Glenn Sather about him watching and making the transition from player to coach. He goes to Edmonton and basically use the Jets blueprint as what he wanted to do with what is known as maybe the greatest dynasty in NHL history, the 80s Oilers. Maybe take us through that a little bit and what he kind of, well, I'm not going to say steal, but he kind of looked at that and thought, that's what I want to do in Edmonton.
He makes no bones about it. He completely stole the Jets blueprint. And when he was playing with the Oilers in, I think it was 75, 76, he never actually got to play against the hotline because he's on the bench. most of the time. But he would watch these guys go up and down the ice. And when he got promoted to player coach, he decided that that's the way they were going to play. And Gretzky told me when he got there that Sather said, "Listen, we're going to do what Winnipeg did in Winnipeg." And so they set about to draft players who could play that style of play, who could play. You had to be quick, you had to be able to take a pass, and you had to be able to move the puck. And so that's where they got guys like Mark Messier and Glenn Anderson and Yari Curry. And there were two guys who were on the original blueprint, Willie Lindstrom and Kent Nilsson, who ended up in Edmonton later on. So, I mean, it couldn't have been a smoother transition for those guys. Just here's how we play. You know how it is because you guys created this style. So he told me that Edmonton won 5 Stanley Cups with that blueprint, and he makes no bones about it that was a complete ripoff with a bit of Montreal Canadiens flavor thrown in there also. But he saw it up close, and he thought that's the way hockey should be played. He had been through some of the rough and tumble times in the NHL with the Bruins and the Flyers. He had seen some of the goons like Bad News Bilodeau and other players on the Birmingham Bulls, and he thought, listen, this is a beautiful way to play. It's a possession kind of game. I can't do it. I can't do it myself, but we're going to get guys who can play that kind of game, and they did. And obviously, the 84-85 team was voted as the greatest team of all time, right?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Geoff, thanks so much for joining us here this morning. I really appreciate it. I really enjoyed this interview here today. I'm sure the book is fascinating, but the topic itself, to me, I think if you're a hockey fan, it's basically a must because it explains a lot of as you just mentioned. If Slats was influenced at that point, moving on, then you have to like one of those family trees where this begat this, who begat that. I mean, it kind of starts a lot of that, and of course we know what the Oilers did, and we understand exactly what that kind of hockey was. And if it starts here, then that I think is really a remarkable story.
And Sather, I mean, everyone regards Sather as a genius. Well, if he's a genius, what are the guys in Winnipeg in '74? I mean, those guys obviously were ahead of their time. And if there was a national TV contract with the WHA in '78 that could have showed that game with the Soviet national team, then I think we'd be talking about a different greatest game of all time. But the problem was the WHA and the NHL didn't get along. CBC was partnered with the NHL, so CBC showed St. Louis versus Spartak that night when the Jets played the Soviet national team. Do you guys know who won between St. Louis and Spartak?
Okay, I didn't even realize that was a game.
The answer is it doesn't matter. No one cares.
Yeah.
Because it was two 14th place teams. But unfortunately, only 10,000 people in Winnipeg Arena saw that game, and a few thousand more on local TV. But so unfortunately, a lot of it has gone down in kind of folklore. But guys, people who are at that game will say that was the greatest game of all time.
Well, it's just great stuff. Geoff, thanks so much for joining us here this morning. Really appreciate it. Hopefully we can catch up with you again soon. But it was wonderful here today, and I look forward to reading the book, and I appreciate it.
Anytime, guys. Thanks a lot.
Geoff Kirbyson joining us here today. The book is called The Hotline, How the Legendary Trio of Hall, Hedberg, Nilsson, and it really transformed the Jets into, well, it's almost, you can't say myth because they saw it, but the reason I use that word is what he just described. If you're telling me in Toronto between 1972 and 1979, which is my era,
yep,
that I knew what was going on in not only the WHA, regardless of the Toronto Toros, that I saw what was being produced, that I was familiar with the Avco. If you'd asked me what the Avco Cup was in those days, I said, does that have something to do with vacuum cleaners? No. I wouldn't have known, Dave. And so, therefore, the stories you hear, it sounds mythical. But for those who saw it, they know it was real.
Yeah, it sure was. And it still gets played every once in a while. There's some really good documentaries on it. Ed Willis has a fantastic book called The Rebel League. It's about the WHA, and a lot of it has to do with the Jets. And Geoff's written a masterpiece. Once again, it's called The Hotline. It's available on Great Plains Publishing. It's been out for a bit, so definitely if you get a chance to pick it up, it's still in good bookstores anywhere. Go right to the publishing company, pick it up. It's a fantastic read for anybody that likes a stick and a puck. That's the highest recommendation I could give.
I think if you're a true hockey fan, I mean, I think a Liam McGuire would probably look at this book and not only would know a lot about it, but he would tell you this is a hockey book I think you need to have.